The Flayed Hand. One evening about 8 months ago I met with some college comrades at the lodgings of our friend Louis R. We drank punch and smoked, talked of literature and art, made jokes like any other company of young men. Suddenly the door flew open, and one who had been my friend since boyhood burst in like a hurricane. "Guess where I come from," he cried. "I bed on the Mabille," responded one. "No," said another, "you're too gay. You come from borrowing money, from burying a rich uncle, or from pawning your watch." "You're getting sober," cried a third, "and as you scented the punch in Louis's room, you came up here to get drunk again." "You're all wrong," he replied. "I come from P in Normandy, where I have spent 8 days, and whence I have brought one of my friends, a great criminal, whom I ask permission to present to you." With these words he drew from his pocket a long, black hand, from which the skin had been stripped. It had been severed at the wrist. Its dry and shrivelled shape, and the narrow, yellowed nails, still clinging to the fingers, made it frightful to look upon. The muscles, which showed that its first owner had been possessed of great strength, were bound in place by a strip of parchment-like skin. "Just fancy," said my friend, "the other day they sold the effects of an old sorcerer, recently deceased, well known in all the country. Every Saturday night he used to go to witch gatherings on a broomstick. He practised the white magic and the black, gave blue milk to the cows, and made them wear tails like that of the companion of St. Anthony. The old scoundrel always had a deep affection for this hand, which, he said, was that of a celebrated criminal, executed in 1736 for having thrown his lawful wife head first into a well, for which I do not blame him, and then hanging in the belfry the priest who had married him. After this double exploit he went away, and during his subsequent career, which was brief but exciting, he robbed 12 travellers, smoked a score of monks in their monastery, and made a seraglio of a convent." "But what are you going to do with this horror?" we cried. "Eh, parbleu! I will make it the handle of my door bell, and frighten my creditors." "My friend," said Henry Smith, a big phlegmatic Englishman, "I believe that this hand is only a kind of Indian meat, preserved by a new process. I advise you to make bouillon of it." "Rail not, messieurs," said, with the utmost sang-froid, a medical student who was 3/4 drunk, "but if you follow my advice, Pierre, you'll give this piece of human debris Christian burial, for fear lest its owner should come to demand it. Then, too, this hand has acquired some bad habits, for you know the proverb, 'Who has killed will kill.'" "And who has drank will drink," replied the host as he poured out a big glass of punch for the student, who emptied it at a draught and slid dead drunk under the table. His sudden dropping out of the company was greeted with a burst of laughter, and Pierre, raising his glass and saluting the hand, cried, "I drink to the next visit of thy master." Then the conversation turned upon other subjects, and shortly afterward each returned to his lodgings. About 2 o'clock the next day I was passing Pierre's door. I entered and found him reading and smoking. "Well, how goes it?" said I. "Very well," he responded. "And your hand?" "My hand? Did you not see it on the bell pull? I put it there when I returned home last night. But apropos of this, what do you think? Some idiot, doubtless to play a stupid joke on me, came ringing at my door towards midnight. I demanded who was there, but as no one replied, I went back to bed again and to sleep." At this moment the door opened, and the landlord, a fat and extremely impertinent person, entered without saluting us. "Sir," said he, "I pray you take away immediately that carrion which you have hung to your bell pull. Unless you do this I shall be compelled to ask you to leave." "Sir," responded Pierre, with much gravity, "you insult a hand which does not merit it. You know that it belonged to a man of high breeding?" The landlord turned on his heel and made his exit, without speaking. Pierre followed him, detached the hand, and affixed it to the bell cord hanging in his alcove. "That is better," said he. This hand, like the brother, all must die, of the Trappists, will give my thoughts a serious turn every night before I sleep. At the end of an hour I left him and returned to my own apartment. I slept badly the following night and was nervous and agitated, and several times awoke with a start. Once I imagined even that a man had broken into my room, and I sprang up and searched the closets and under the bed. Towards 6 o'clock in the morning I was commencing to doze at last, when a loud knocking at my door made me jump from my couch. It was my friend Pierre's servant, half dressed, pale, and trembling. "Ah, sir," cried he, sobbing, "my poor master! Some one has murdered him." I dressed myself hastily and ran to Pierre's lodgings. The house was full of people disputing together, and everything was in a commotion. Every one was talking at the same time, recounting and commenting on the occurrence in all sorts of ways. With great difficulty I reached the bedroom, made myself known to those guarding the door, and was permitted to enter. 4 agents of police were standing in the middle of the apartment, pencils in hand, examining every detail, conferring in low voices and writing from time to time in their note-books. 2 doctors were in consultation by the bed on which lay the unconscious form of Pierre. He was not dead, but his face was fixed in an expression of the most awful terror. His eyes were open their widest, and the dilated pupils seemed to regard fixedly, with unspeakable horror, something unknown and frightful. His hands were clenched. I raised the quilt which covered his body from the chin downward, and saw on his neck, deeply sunk in the flesh, the marks of fingers. Some drops of blood spotted his shirt. At that moment one thing struck me. I chanced to notice that the shriveled hand was no longer attached to the bell cord. The doctors had doubtless removed it to avoid the comments of those entering the chamber where the wounded man lay, because the appearance of this hand was indeed frightful. I did not inquire what had become of it. I now clipped from a newspaper of the next day the story of the crime with all the details that the police were able to procure. A frightful attempt was made yesterday on the life of young M. Pierre B. student, who belongs to one of the best families in Normandy. He returned home about 10 o'clock in the evening, and excused his valet, Bovin, from further attendance upon him, saying that he felt fatigued and was going to bed. Towards midnight, Bovin was suddenly awakened by the furious ringing of his master's bell. He was afraid and lighted a lamp and waited. The bell was silent about a minute, then rang again with such vehemence that the domestic, mad with fright, flew from his room to awaken the concierge, who ran to summon the police, and at the end of about 15 minutes 2 policemen forced open the door. A horrible sight met their eyes. Furniture was overturned, giving evidence of a fearful struggle between the victim and his assailant. In the middle of the room, upon his back, his body rigid, with livid face and frightfully dilated eyes, lay motionless young Pierre B., bearing upon his neck the deep imprints of 5 fingers. Dr. Bourdian was called immediately, and his report says that the aggressor must have been possessed of prodigious strength, and have had an extraordinarily thin and sinewy hand, because the fingers left in the flesh of the victims 5 holes like those from a pistol ball, and had penetrated until they almost met. There is no clue to the motive of the crime or to its perpetrator. The police are making a thorough investigation. The following appeared in the same newspaper next day. Monsieur Pierre B., the victim of the frightful assault of which we published an account yesterday, has regained consciousness after 2 hours of the most assiduous care by Dr. Bourdian. His life is not in danger, but it is strongly feared that he has lost his reason. No trace has been found of his assailant. My poor friend was indeed insane. For 7 months I visited him daily at the hospital where we had placed him, but he did not recover the light of reason. In his delirium strange words escaped him, and, like all madmen, he had one fixed idea. He believed himself continually pursued by a spectre. One day they came for me in haste, saying he was worse, and when I arrived I found him dying. For 2 hours he remained very calm, then suddenly, rising from his bed in spite of our efforts, he cried, waving his arms as if a prey to the most awful terror, "Take it away! Take it away! It strangles me! Help! Help!" Twice he made the circuit of the room, uttering horrible screams, then fell face downward, dead. As he was an orphan, I was charged to take the body to the little village of P in Normandy, where his parents were buried. It was the place from which he had arrived the evening he found us drinking punch in Louis R.'s room, when he had presented us the flayed hand. His body was enclosed in a lead coffin, and 4 days afterwards I walked sadly beside the old curé, who had given him his first lessons, to the little cemetery where they dug his grave. It was a beautiful day, and sunshine from a cloudless sky flooded the earth. Birds sang from the blackberry bushes where many a time when we were children we had stolen to eat the fruit. Again I saw Pierre and myself creeping along behind the hedge and slipping through the gap that we knew so well, down at the end of the little plot where they buried the poor. Again we would return to the house with cheeks and lips black with the juice of the berries we had eaten. I looked at the bushes. They were covered with fruit. Mechanically I picked some and bore it to my mouth. The curé had opened up his breviary and was muttering his prayers in a low voice. I heard at the end of the walk the spades of the gravediggers who were opening the tomb. Suddenly they called out. The curé closed his book, and we went to see what they wished of us. They had found a coffin. In digging a stroke of the pickaxe had started the cover, and we perceived within a skeleton of unusual stature, laying on its back, its hollow eyes seeming yet to menace and defy us. I was troubled, I know not why, and almost afraid. "Hold!" cried one of the men. "Look there! One of the rascal's hands has been severed at the wrist. Ah, here it is!" And he picked up from beside the body a huge withered hand, and held it out to us. "See," cried the other, laughing, "see how he glares at you, as if he would spring at your throat to make you give back his hand." "Go," said the curé, "leave the dead in peace, and close the coffin. We will make poor Pierre's grave elsewhere." The next day all was finished, and I returned to Paris, after having left 50 francs with the old curé for masses to be said for the repose of the soul of him whose sepulchre we had troubled. The Parlor-Car Ghost. All draped with blue denim, the seaside cottage of my friend Sarah Pine. She asked me to go there with her when she opened to have it set in order for the summer. She confessed she felt a trifle nervous at the idea of entering it alone. And I'm always ready for an excursion. So much blue denim rather surprised me, because blue is not complimentary to Sarah's complexion. She always wears some shade of red by preference. She perceived my wonder. She is very near-sighted and therefore sees everything by some sort of sixth sense. "You do not like my portieres and curtains and table covers," she said. "Neither do I, but I did it to accommodate. And now he rests well in his grave, I hope." "Whose grave, for pity's sake?" "Mr. J. Billington Price's." "And who is he? He doesn't sound interesting." "Then I will tell you about him," said Sarah, taking a seat directly in front of one of those curtains. "Last autumn I was leaving this place for New York, traveling on the fast express train known as the Flying Yankee. Of course, I thought of the Flying Dutchman and Wagner's musical setting of the uncanny legend, and how different things are in these days of steam, etc. Then I looked out of the window at the landscape, the horizon that seemed to wheel in a great curve as the train sped on. Every now and then I had an impression at the tail of the eye that a man was sitting in a chair 3 or 4 numbers in front of me on the opposite side of the car. Each time that I saw this shape I looked at the chair and ascertained that it was unoccupied. But it was an odd trick of vision. I raised my lorgnette, and the chair showed emptier than before. There was nobody in it, certainly. But the more I knew that it was vacant, the more plainly I saw the man. Always with the corner of my eye. It made me nervous. When passengers entered the car I dreaded lest they might take that seat. What would happen if they should? A bag was put in the chair. That made me uncomfortable. The bag was removed at the next station. Then a baby was placed in the seat. It began to laugh as though someone had gently tickled it. There was something odd about that chair. 13 was its number. When I looked away from it the impression was strong upon me that some person sitting there was watching me. Really, it would not do to humour such fancies. So I touched the electric button, asked the porter to bring me a table, and taking from my bag a pack of cards, proceeded to divert myself with a game of patience. I was puzzling where to put a 7 of spades. "Where can it go?" I murmured to myself. A voice behind me prompted, "Play the 4 of diamonds on the 5, and you can do it." I started. The only occupants of the car besides me were a bridal couple, a mother with 3 little children, and a typical preacher of one of the straightest sects. Who had spoken? "Play up the 4, madam," repeated this voice. I looked fearfully over my shoulder. At first I saw a bluish cloud, like cigar smoke, but inodorous. Then the vision cleared, and I saw a young man whom I knew by a subtle intuition to be the occupant, seen and not seen, of chair number 13. Evidently he was a travelling salesman, and a ghost. Of course, a drummer's ghost sounds ridiculous, they're so extremely alive. Or else you would expect a dead drummer to be particularly dead and not walk. This was a most commonplace looking ghost, cordial, pushing, businesslike. At the same time his face had an expression of utter despair and horror, which made him still more preposterous. Of course it is not nice to let a stranger speak to one, even on so impersonal a topic as a 4 of diamonds. But a ghost! There can't be any rule of etiquette about talking with a ghost. My dear, it was dreadful. That forward creature showed me how to play all the cards, and then begged me to lay them out again, in order that he might give me some clever points. I was too much amazed and disturbed to speak. I could only place the cards at his suggestion. This I did so as not to appear to be listening to the empty air, and be supposed to be a crazy woman. Presently the ghost spoke again, and told me his story. "Madam," he said, "I have been riding back and forth on this car ever since February 22, 1890. 7 months and 11 days. All this time I have not exchanged a word with anyone. For a drummer, it's pretty hard, you may believe. You know the story of the Flying Dutchman? Well, that is very nearly my case. A curse is upon me and will not be removed until some kind soul. But I'm getting ahead of my text. That day there were 4 of us, travelling for different houses. One of the boys was in wool, one in baking powder, one in boots and shoes, and myself in cotton goods. We met on the road, took seats together, and fell into talking shop. Those fellows told big lies about their sales, Washington's birthday though it was. The baking powder man raised the amount of the bills of goods which he had sold better than a whole can of his stuff could have done. I admitted the straight truth, that I had not yet been able to make a sale. And then I swore, not in a light-minded, chipper style of verbal trimmings, but a great, round, heaven-defying oath, that I would sell a case of blue denim on that trip if it took me forever. We became dry with talk, and when the train stopped at Rivermouth, we went out to have some beer. It is good there, you know. Pardon me. I forgot I was speaking to a lady. Well, we had to run to get aboard. I missed my footing, fell under the wheels, and the next thing I knew they were holding an inquest over my remains, while I, disembowelled, was sitting in a corner of the undertaker's table, wondering which of the coroner's jury was likely to want a case of blue denims. Then I remembered my wicked oath, and understood that I was a soul doomed to wander until I could succeed in selling that bill of goods. I spoke once or twice, offering the denims under value, but nobody noticed me. Verdict: accidental death. Negligence of deceased. Railroad corporation not to blame. Deceased got out for beer at his own risk. The other drummers took charge of the remains, and wrote a beautiful letter to my relatives about my social qualities and my impressive conversation. I wish it had been less impressive at that time. I might have lied about my sales, or I might have said that I hoped for better luck. But after that oath there was nothing for it. Back and forth on this road, in chair number 13, to all eternity. Nobody suspects my presence. They sit on my knees. I'm playing in luck when it is a nice baby as it was this afternoon. They pile wraps, bags, even railway literature on me. They play cards under my nose, and what duffers some of them are! You, madam, are the first person who has perceived me, and therefore I venture to speak to you, meaning no offence. I can see that you are sorry for me. Now, if you recall the story of the Flying Dutchman, he was saved by the charity of a good woman. In fact, Senta married him. Now I'm not asking anything of that size. I see that you wear a wedding ring, and no doubt you make some man's happiness. I wasn't a marrying man myself, and naturally I'm not a marrying ghost. And that has nothing to do with the matter anyway. But if you could, I don't suppose you would have any use for them, but if you were disposed to do a good turn, solid Christian charity, I should be everlastingly grateful, and you may have that case of denim at $72.50. And that quality is quoted today at $80. Does it go, madam?" The speech of the poor ghost was not very eloquent, but his eyes had an intense, eager glare, which was terrible. Something, pity, fear, I do not know what, compelled me. I decided to do without that white and gold evening cloak. Instead, I gave $72.50 to the ghost and took from him a receipt for the sum, signed J. Billington Price. Then he smiled contentedly, thanked me with emotion, and returned to chair number 13. Several times on the journey, although I did not perceive him again, I felt dazed. When the train arrived at New York, and I, with the other passengers, dismounted, it seemed to me that a strong hand passed under my elbow, steadying me down the steps. As I walked the length of the station, my bag, not heavy at any time, appeared to become weightless. I believe that the parlor-car ghost walked beside me, carrying the bag, whose handle still remained in my other hand. Indeed, once or twice I thought I felt the touch of cold fingers against mine. Since then I have no reason to suppose that the poor ghost is not at rest. I hope he is. But I never expected nor wished for the blue denims. The next day, however, a dray belonging to a great wholesale house backed up to our door and delivered a case of denims, with a receipted bill for the same. What was I to do? I could not go about selling blue denims. I could not give them away without exciting comment. So I furnished the cottage with them, and you know the effect on my complexion. Pity me, dear, and credit me, frivolous woman as I am, with having saved a soul at the expense of my own vanity. My story is told. What do you think about it? Ghost of Buckstown Inn. Several travel-worn drummers sat in the lobby exchanging yarns. It was Rodney Green's turn, and he looked wise and began his tale. I don't claim, by any means, that the belief in ghosts is a general thing in Arkansas, but I do say that I had an experience out there a few years ago. It was late in the fall, and I happened to be in the village of Buckstown, which desecrates a very limited portion of the state. The town is as small and dirty a place as I ever saw, and the Buckstown Inn was not much above the general character of the place. The region is inhabited by natives who still cling to all sorts of foolish superstitions. The inn, in the antebellum days, was kept by one who was said to be the meanest and most crabbed of mortals. The old demon was as miserly as he was mean, and all his narrow life he hoarded his filthy lucre with fiendish greed. Report had it also that he had even murdered his patrons in their beds for their money. What the facts actually were, I don't know, but even so to this day the old inn is held in suspicion. A lingering effect of former horrors still clouds its memory. The present proprietor, Bunk Watson, his real name is Bunker, I believe, is an altogether different sort of chap, a Southern style, in fact, one of those shiftless, heedless, happy-go-lucky mortals who love strong whiskey, and who chews an enormous quid of black tobacco and smokes a corncob pipe at the same time. When the former keeper shuffled off, his property fell to a distant relative, the present keeper, who, with his family, immediately moved in from a neighboring hamlet and took possession. It was well known that the old proprietor had accumulated considerable wealth during his sojourn among the living, but all efforts to discover any treasure upon the premises had failed, and now the idea of ever finding it was practically given up. As far as Bunk was concerned, the matter troubled him little. He had a hard-working wife who ran things the best she could under the circumstances, and saw that his meals were forthcoming at their respective intervals. What more could he wish? Why should he care if there was a treasure buried upon his place? Indeed, it would have been a sore puzzle for him to know what to do with a fortune unless perhaps his wife came to his aid. Among the stories that hovered in the history of the Buckstown Inn was one which involved a ghost. In the room where the former keeper had died peculiar noises were heard at unearthly hours, sighing, moaning, and in fact all the other indications which point to the existence of ghosts were said to be present. On account of this the chamber had long since been abandoned. I listened with keen interest to the wonderful tales about the haunted rooms, and then suddenly resolved to investigate, to sleep in that chamber that very night and see for myself all that was to be seen. I told Buck of my purpose. He shook his head, shrugged his shoulders, but instead of warning me and offering a flood of protests, as I expected, he merely took his pipe from his mouth, let fly a quart or so of yellowish juice from between a pair of brown-stained lips, and, opening one corner of his wide mouth, lazily called out, "Jane." His wife appeared, and he intimated that I should settle the matter with the old woman. The prospect of a fee persuaded the wife, and off she went to arrange for my bed in that ill-fated room. At 9 o'clock that evening I bid the family good night, took my candle, ascended the rickety stairs, and entered the chamber of horrors. The atmosphere was heavy, and had a peculiar odor that was not at all pleasing. However, I latched the door and was soon in bed. Having propped myself up with pillows, I was prepared to await the coming of the ghost. Overhead the dusty rafters, which once had experienced the sensation of being whitewashed, but were now a dirty yellowish color, were hung with a fantastic array of cobwebs. The flickering light of the candle reflected upon the walls and against the ceiling a pyramid of grotesque shapes, and with this effect being continually disturbed by the swaying cobwebs, the whole caused the room to appear rather ghostly after all, and especially so to an imaginative mind. I waited and waited for hours, it seemed, but still no ghost. Perhaps it was afraid of my candle light, so I blew it out. No sooner had I done this and settled back in bed again than a white hand appeared through the door, then a whole figure. At last the ghost had come, a white and sheeted ghost. It had come right through the door, although it was locked, and now advanced toward the bed. Raising its long white arm, it pointed a bony finger at me, and then commanded, "Come with me." Thereupon it turned from the door, while instantly I jumped out of bed to follow. Some unseen power compelled me to obey. The door flew open, and the ghost led me down the stairs, through long halls into the cellar, through mysterious underground corridors, upstairs again, in and out rooms which I never dreamed were to be found in that old rambling inn. Finally, through a small door in the rear, we left the house. I was in my sleeping garments, but no matter, I had to follow. The white form, with a slow and measured tread and as silent as death, led the way into the orchard. There, under a tree at the farther end, it pointed to the ground, and in the same ghostly tones before used, said, "Here you will find a great treasure buried." Then the ghost disappeared, and I saw it no more. I stood dazed and trembling. Upon recovering my wits, I started to dig, but the chill of the night air and the scantiness of my night robes made such labor impracticable. So I decided to leave some mark to identify the place and come round again at daybreak. I reached up and broke off a limb. Overcome with my night's exertions, I slept the next morning until a loud rapping on my door and a croaking voice warned me that it was noon. I had intended to leave Buckstown Inn that day, but prompted by curiosity and anxious to investigate, I unpacked my gripsack for a comfortable stay. You must understand that this was my first experience with a ghost, and I feared I might never see another. At breakfast my lady waited on me in silence, though once I detected her eyes following me with a peculiar expression. She wanted to ask me how I enjoyed the night, but I would not gratify her by volunteering a word. My host was more outspoken. "Reckon you didn't get much sleep," said he, with a queer smile. "Did you hear anything?" I asked. "Well, I did, yes," he said, with a drawl, "but you didn't disturb me any. I knew you'd have trouble when you went into that room to sleep." That afternoon I slipped out to the tree, but to my amazement I found that the twig I had broken from the branches was gone. Finally I found under the lower trunk of an apple tree an open place from which a small branch had evidently been wrested. But on looking further, I discovered that every apple tree in the orchard had been similarly disfigured. "More mysterious than ever," I said, "but to-night shall decide." That night I pleaded weariness, which no one seemed inclined to question, and sought my couch earlier. "Going to try it again?" asked my host. "Yes, and I'll stay all winter, but what I'll get even with that ghost," I said. That night I kept the candle burning until midnight, when I blew it out. Instantly the room was flooded with a soft light, and at the foot of the bed stood my ghost, the identical ghost of last night. Again the bony finger beckoned, and a sepulchral voice whispered, "Follow me." I sprang from the bed, but the figure darted ahead of me. It flew through the doorway and down the stairs, and I after it. At the foot of the stairs an unseen hand reached forward and caught my foot, and I fell sprawling headlong. But in a second I was on my feet and pursuing the ghost. It had gained on me a few yards, but I was quicker, and just as we reached the outside door I nearly touched its robes. They sent a chill through my frame, and I nearly gave up the pursuit. As it passed through the doorway, it turned and gave me one look, and I caught the same malignant light in its eyes that I remembered from the night before. In the open orchard I felt sure I could catch it. But my ghost had no intention of allowing me any such opportunity. To my disgust, it darted backward and into the house, slamming the door in my face. In my frenzy of fear and chagrin, I threw myself against the oaken door with such force that its rusty old hinges yielded, and I landed in the big front room of the inn, just in time to see the white skirts of the ghost flit up the stairs. Upstairs I flew after it, and into an old chamber. There, huddled in a corner, I saw it. In the minute's delay it had secured a lighted candle, and as I entered, it advanced to daunt me with bony arm upraised to a great height. "Caught!" I cried, throwing my arms around the figure, and I made the acquaintance of a real live ghost. The white robes fell, and I saw revealed my hostess of Buckstown Inn. Next morning, when I threatened to call the police, she confessed to me that she had masqueraded as a ghost to draw visitors to the out-of-the-way old place, and that she found its tale of being haunted highly profitable to her. A phantom toe. I'm not a superstitious man, far from it, but despite all my efforts to the contrary, I could not help thinking, directly I had taken a survey of my chamber, that I should never quit it without going through a strange adventure. There was something in its immense size, heaviness and gloom that seemed to annihilate at one blow all my resolute skepticism as regards supernatural visitations. It appeared to me totally impossible to go into that room and disbelieve in ghosts. The fact is, I had incautiously partaken at supper of that favourite Dutch dish, sauerkraut, and I suppose it had disagreed with me, and put strange fancies into my head. But this be as it may, I only know that after parting with my friend for the night, I gradually worked myself up into such a state of fidgetness that at last I wasn't sure whether I had become a ghost myself. Supposing, ruminated I, supposing the landlord himself should be a practical robber, and should have taken the lock and bolt from off this door for the purpose of entering here in the dead of night, abstracting all my property, and perhaps murdering me. I thought the dog had a very cut-throat air about him. Now, I had never had any such idea until that moment, for my host was a fat all Dutchmen are fat stupid-looking fellow, who I don't believe had sense enough to understand what a robbery or murder meant. But somehow or other, whenever we have anything really to annoy us, and certainly it was not pleasant to go to bed in a strange place without being able to fasten one's door, we are sure to aggravate it by myriads of chimeras of our own brain. So on the present occasion, in the midst of 1,000 disagreeable reveries, some of the most wild absurdity, I jumped very gloomily into bed, having first put out my candle, for total darkness is far preferable to its flickering, ghostly light, which transformed rather than revealed objects, and soon fell asleep, perfectly tired out with my day's writing. How long I lay asleep I don't know, but I suddenly awoke from a disagreeable dream of cutthroats, ghosts, and long winding passages in a haunted inn. An indescribable feeling such as I never before experienced hung upon me. It seemed as if every nerve in my body had 100 spirits tickling it, and this was accompanied by so great a heat that inwardly, cursing mine's host sauerkraut and wondering how the Dutchman could endure such a poison, I was forced to sit up in bed to cool myself. The whole of the room was profoundly dark, excepting at one place, where the moonlight, falling through a crevice in the shutters, threw a straight line about an inch or so thick upon the floor, clear, sharp, and intensely brilliant against the darkness. I leave you to conceive my horror when, upon looking at this said line of light, I saw there a naked human toe, nothing more. For the first instant I thought the vision must be some effect of moonlight, then that I was only half awake and could not distinctly see. So I rubbed my eyes 2 or 3 times and looked again. Still there was the accursed thing, plain, distinct, immovable, marble-like in its fixedness and rigidity, but in everything else horribly human. I am not an easily frightened man. No one who has travelled so much and seen so much has been exposed to so many dangers as I can be. But there was something so mysterious and unusual in the appearance of this single toe, that for a short time I could not think what to be at, so I did nothing but stare at it in a state of utter bewilderment. At length, however, as the toe did not vanish under my steady gaze, I thought I might as well change my tactics, and remembering that all midnight invaders, be they thieves, ghosts, or devils, dislike nothing so much as a good noise, I shouted out in a loud voice, "Who's there?" The toe immediately disappeared in the darkness. Almost simultaneously with my words I leapt out of bed and rushed towards the place where I had beheld the strange appearance. The next instant I ran against something and felt an iron grip round my body. After this I have no distinct recollection of what occurred, excepting that a fearful struggle ensued between me and my unseen opponent, that every now and then we were violently hurled to the floor, from which we always rose again in an instant, locked in a deadly embrace; that we tugged and strained and pulled and pushed, I in the convulsive and frantic energy of a fight for life, he, for by this time I had discovered that the intruder was a human being actuated by some passion of which I was ignorant; that we whirled round and round, cheek to cheek and arm to arm, in fierce contest, till the room appeared to whiz round us, and that at least a dozen people, my fellow traveller among them, roused, I suppose, by our repeated falls, came pouring into the room with lights and showed me struggling with a man having nothing on but a shirt, whose long tangled hair and wild, unsettled eyes told me he was insane. And then, for the first time, I became aware that I had received in the conflict several gashes from a knife, which my opponent still held in his hand. To conclude my story in a few words, for I dare say all of you by this time are getting very tired, it turned out that my midnight visitor was a madman who was being conveyed to a lunatic asylum at the Hague, and that he and his keeper had been obliged to stop at Delft on their way. The poor fellow had contrived during the night to escape from his keeper, who had carelessly forgotten to lock the door of his chamber, and with that irresistible desire to shed blood particular to so many insane people had possessed himself of a pocket knife belonging to the man who had charge of him, entered my room, which was most likely the only one in the house unfastened, and was probably meditating the fatal stroke when I saw his toe in the moonlight, the rest of his body being hidden in the shade. After this terrible freak of his he was watched with much greater strictness, but I ought to observe, as some excuse for the keeper's negligence, that this was the first act of violence he had ever attempted. Mrs. Davenport's Ghost. Dear readers, do you agree with Hamlet? Do you believe that there is more between heaven and earth than we dream of in our philosophy? Does it seem impossible to you that Eliphas Levi conjured up the shade of Apollonius of Tyana, the prophet of Magi, in a London hotel, and that the great sage, William Crookes, drank his tea at breakfast several days a week, for months in succession, in the society of the materialized spirit of a young lady, attired in white linen, with a feather turban on her head? Do not laugh. Panic would seize you in the presence even of a turbaned spirit, and the grotesque spectacle but would intensify your terror. As for me, I did not laugh last night on reading an account in the New York newspaper of a criminal trial that will probably terminate in the death penalty of the accused. It is a sad case. I shudder as I transcribe the records of the trial from the testimony of the hotel waiter, who heard the conversation of the two confederates through a keyhole, and of 40 thoroughly credible witnesses, who testified to the same facts. What would my feelings if I had seen the beautiful victim with the gaping wound in her breast, into which she dipped her finger to mark the brow of her murderer? About 3 o'clock in the afternoon of February 3rd, Professor Davenport and Miss Ida Southcott, a very pale and delicate young girl, who had submitted to the tests of Professor Davenport for a number of years, were finishing their dinner in their room in the second story of a New York hotel. Professor Benjamin Davenport was a celebrity, but it was said that he owed his fame to somewhat questionable means. The leading spiritualists did not repose the confidence in him that manifestly marked their regard for William Crookes or Daniel Douglas Home. Greedy and unscrupulous mediums, the author of spiritualism in America thinks, are to blame for the most bitter attacks to which our cause has been exposed. When the materializations do not take place as quickly as circumstances require, they resort to trickery and fraud to extricate themselves from a dilemma. Professor Benjamin Davenport belonged to these versatile mediums. Aside from this, queer stories were afloat about him. He was secretly accused of highway robbery in South America, cheating at cards in the gambling houses of San Francisco, and the over-hasty use of firearms towards persons who had never offended him. It was said almost openly that the professor's wife had died from abuse and grief at his infidelity. But in spite of these annoying rumors, Mr. Davenport, by virtue of his skill as a fraud and faker, continued to exercise a great deal of influence upon certain plain and simple-minded folks, whom it was impossible to convince that they had not touched the materialized spirits of their brothers, mothers, or sisters through the agency of his wonderful power. His professional success received material ascension from his swarthy, Mephisto-like countenance, his deep fiery eyes, his large curved nose, the cynical expression of his mouth, and the lofty, almost prophetic tone of his words. When the waiter had made his last visit, he did not go far. The following conversation took place in the room. "There is to be a seance this evening at the residence of Mrs. Harding," began the medium. "Quite a number of influential people will be there, and 2 or 3 millionaires. Conceal under your skirt the blonde woman's wig and the white material in which the spirits usually make their appearance." "Very well," replied Ida Southcott, in a resigned tone. The waiter heard her pace the room. After a pause, she asked, "Whose spirit are you going to control this evening, Benjamin?" The waiter heard a loud, brutal laugh and the chair groaning beneath the weight of the demonstrative professor. "Guess." "How should I know?" she asked. "I am going to conjure up the spirit of my dead wife." And another burst of laughter issued from the room, full of sinister levity. A cry of terror burst from Ida's lips. A muffled sound indicated to the eavesdropper at the door that she was dragging herself to the feet of the professor. "Benjamin, Benjamin, don't do it," she sobbed. "Why not? They say I broke Mrs. Davenport's heart. The story is damaging my reputation, but it will be forgotten if her spirit should address me in terms of endearment from the other shore in the presence of numerous witnesses. For you will speak to me tenderly, will you not, Ida?" "No, no, you shall not do it. You shall not think of it. Listen to me, for God's sake. During the 4 years that I have been with you, I have obeyed you faithfully and suffered patiently. I have lied and deceived, like you. I learned to imitate the sleep and symptoms of clairvoyance. Tell me, did I ever refuse to serve you, or utter a word of complaint, even when my shoulders bent with the weight of my burden, when you pierced the flesh of my arms with knitting needles? Worse than all this, I imitated distant voices behind curtains, and made mothers and wives believe that their sons and husbands had come from a better world to communicate with them. How often have I performed the most dangerous feats in parlors, with the lamps turned low! Clothed in a shroud or white muslin, I essayed to represent supernatural forms, whom tear-dimmed eyes recognized as those of departed dear ones. You do not know what I suffered at this unhallowed work. You scoff at the mysteries of eternity. I suffer the torments of an impending retribution. My God! If some time the dead whom I counterfeit should rise up before me with uplifted arms and dreadful imprecations. This constant terror has injured my heart. It will kill me. I am consumed by fever. Look how emaciated, how worn out and downcast I am, but I am under your control. Do as you like with me. I am in your power, and I want it to be so. Have I ever complained? But do not force me to do this thing, Benjamin. Have pity on me for what I have done for you in the past, for what I am suffering. Do not attempt this mummery. Do not compel me to play the role of your dead wife, who was so tender and beautiful. Oh, what put that into your mind? Spare me, Benjamin, I implore you." The professor did not laugh again. Amid the confusion of upturned articles of furniture the eavesdropper distinguished the sound of a skull striking the floor. He concluded that Professor Davenport had knocked Miss Ida down with a blow of his fist, or kicked her as she approached him. But the waiter did not enter the room, as no one rang for him. That evening 40 persons were assembled in Miss Joanne Harding's parlor, staring at a curtain where the spirit form was in process of materializing. One dark lantern in a corner of the room contributed the light that emphasized the darkness rather than relieved it. The room was pervaded by profound silence, save the quickened, suppressed breathing of the spectators. The fire in the grate cast mysterious rays of light, resembling fugitive spirits, upon the objects around, almost indistinguishable in the semi-gloom. Professor Davenport was at his best this evening. The spirit world obeyed him without hesitation, like their lawful master. He was the mighty prince of souls. Hands that had no arms were seen picking flowers from the vases. The touch of an invisible spirit conjured sweet melodies from the keys of the piano. The furniture responded by intelligent rappings to the most unanticipated questions. The professor himself elevated his form in symbolical distortions from the floor to an altitude of 3 feet, indicated by Mrs. Harding, and remained suspended in the air for a quarter of an hour, holding live coals in his hands. But the most interesting, as well as the most conclusive test, was to be the materialization of the spirit of Mrs. Arabella Davenport, which the professor had promised at the beginning of the séance. "The hour is come," exclaimed the medium. And while the hearts of all throbbed with anxious suspense, and their eyes distended with painful expectancy of the promised materialization, Benjamin Davenport stood before the curtain. In the twilight the tall man with the dishevelled hair and demon look was really terrible and handsome. "Appear, Arabella," he exclaimed in a commanding voice, with gestures of the Nazarene at the sepulchre of Lazarus. Suddenly a cry burst from behind the curtain, a piercing, shuddering, horrible shriek, the shriek of an expiring soul. The spectators trembled. Mrs. Harding almost fainted. The medium himself appeared surprised. But Benjamin recovered his composure on seeing the curtain move and admit the spirit. The apparition was that of a young woman with long blonde tresses. She was beautiful and pale, clad in some light, whitish material. Her breast was bare, and on the left side appeared a bleeding wound, in which trembled a knife. The spectators rose and retreated, pushing their chairs to the wall. Those who chanced to look at the medium noticed that a deadly pallor had overspread his face, and that he was cowering and trembling. But the young woman, Mrs. Arabella, the real one, whom he so well remembered, she had come in response to his summons, and advanced in a direct line toward Benjamin, who in terror covered his eyes to shut out the ghastly sight, and with a cry fled behind the furniture. But she dipped the finger of her thin hand into the blood from her wound, and traced it across the brow of the unconscious medium, the while repeating in slow, monotonous tone that sounded like the echo of a wail, again and again, "You are my murderer! You are my murderer!" And while he was rolling and tossing in deadly terror on the floor, they turned up the lights. The spirit had vanished, but in the communicating room behind the curtain they found the body of poor Miss Ida Southcott with horribly distorted features. A physician who was present pronounced it a heart stroke. And that is the reason that Professor Benjamin Davenport appeared alone in a New York courtroom to answer to the charge of having murdered his wife 4 years ago in San Francisco. Thank you for listening.